Welcome to the one and only Part 2, Part B, Biological Beginnings. Welcome. Doing a radio announcer voice for some weird reason, but I hope you're doing well, and let's get into it. I'm going to basically just start where the last one left off. Alright, hope your day's going well, and it's great to connect with you. Let's jump into the topic. Okay, so the first big slide of the presentation, in the last presentation, in the first part, I went on a bit of a rant about how the relationship between the words evolution and development, and that in developmental psychology we're talking about the life of a single organism, or if we're talking about the development of like a tiger or something, we're talking about from when it's a cub or a baby until when it's a full adult and until the latest stages of its life cycle. And so the reason I said that is just to stress this point that development means within a single lifespan. But there's a recognition that there's, oh, hang on, I hope that's not picking up this noise. I got this fan going one sec. It's actually, Nothing like a bit of dead air in the video. Just had what are those things called? The mister things that like puts a little bit of lemon smell in the air. Um, but that probably sounded a bit like a fan noise. Anyways, I'm gonna try to like not do 9 takes on every slide, so I probably should restart that slide. There's a little bit of dead space there, a little bit of just ranting, but this presentation will hopefully evolve and get better as I go. So this notion though is important that I didn't fully finish my thought that evolution is almost like a series of developments. It's like each notch in that evolutionary line is having its own, each organism I should say is having its own full development. So if we were to make your family line, it's like none of those people are even in your family line in terms of contributing to your genetics if they didn't themselves reach the age of sexual maturity and reproduce. So I want to really highlight this too, is because everyone knows about survival of the fittest. Everyone, or not necessarily everyone, but if you ask them about Darwin, they probably can tell you evolution, and that they'll probably think, oh, Darwin said monkey, humans came from monkeys, which he definitely didn't say. And that, so like saying humans come from apes and saying humans and apes millions of years ago shared a common ancestor, even that is too broad because it's just demonstrating too little of an understanding of what evolution really means. Humans didn't evolve from anything that exists today. And even the questions of like human evolution specifically, once you're back like over 100,000 years, is there's an element of it that's speculation, like the changes that you're gonna hear. But what I'm basically gonna do is teach you like sort of the current, my best understanding of the current understanding of this stuff, right? Like fossil finds and genetics are how we're gonna learn more about our past. They're gonna find wild things with genetics, like how most red hair we think comes from Neanderthals. That's something that people had no idea about a couple decades ago. Well, people have been aware that there were Neanderthals. They've been finding Neanderthal bones for over 100 years. But I think the first use of the word is in like the 1860s. And it's like, so there's this idea for a long time that there were different hominins, like Homin. You know, if you're new to that topic, that's a mind bending topic. You probably heard of Neanderthals. You maybe heard of Homo erectus. You might have heard of the Homo floresiens or the Denisovians. And like, if your ancestors are from Western Europe, the chances that if you did a 23andMe or if you did what's the other one? All these DNA mining things. It's like, anyways, if you did one of those, they would have told you that they might have told you that you have a percentage of your DNA that's Neanderthal. Like, what the heck does that mean? Well, it means that the Neanderthals were at least, they were the same species as us. You could have had, let me just be blunt, a human could have sex with a Neanderthal and have a baby that could have its own baby. And that means it's its own species. And this sort of goes back to, or not go, but this goes back, I just loaded some of the videos in this presentation. One of the presentations I'm going to show you presents this idea. I forget where it is in the order, so it doesn't super matter, but the point is, like, I sometimes ask students when I'm doing this class live, what's the significance? I just glanced and noticed I'm at 5 minutes already. I'm sorry. I'm usually ranty the first few slides and I kind of get my feet under me. It's like, if you ask students, like, what happens if a horse mates with a donkey, and everyone laughs and then they think about it for a second, someone will put their hand up and say, oh, that's called a mule. And it is called a mule. And then you say, okay, well, what's unique about a mule? And that's, people don't necessarily know this, but someone might know this, that mules are sterile. So what's that mean? It means a horse and a donkey are different species. They can still reproduce. They can have a baby, but that baby is sterile. Another example is like a tiger and a lion can have a baby, and depending on which the male is, it's either a tiger, a tigon, or a liger. You can look these up on the internet. A tigon's like Tigon, and a liger is just like exactly how you think, like Liger. Now, these animals usually have tons of health issues and are like mutations. They're literally recombinations that aren't the design, right? So it seems like nature has it built in that if that happens, if two animals in our species reproduce like that, the way to prevent it from continually, I mean this in a way, like remember we're talking about like the gene pool of lions and the gene pool of tigers are separate. They can be passed to the same offspring, but that offspring will have no ability to have babies itself. I've always found that like so fascinating. It's like nature has this like built-in failsafe that even if that happens, it's not going to keep happening because the babies of those creatures or the babies of those parents can't continue the bloodline that way, which is wild. So, Mike, you're 7 minutes in. Would you mind presenting the slide? So, the point here is that sorry, it's like I'm talking to myself too, right? But you know, it's just me and this microphone. It's like evolution has this adaptation, so that's like changing based on pressures in the environment. Reproduction, which means for the bloodline of a species to continue at the most core level, the species needs to, or the organism, just meaning one of them, needs to get to the age where it can sexually reproduce, which for mice is like weeks, and that's why it's like we're never running out of mice, but it's why it's so hard to conserve things like elephant populations and rhino populations, especially. Rhinos is probably a better example because they have so few babies. If rhinos were having like as many babies as like rabbits, you know, it'd be a different issue. But when they're only having a few, and then so this whole idea of like how pregnancy is such an important aspect of this whole story, and how the whole gestation, the whole like pregnancy aspect of this, and then the other thing I'll talk about is sexual selection, because I think that's the most overlooked part of Darwin's idea, that there's a choice piece. It's not just about getting to sexual age, and it's not just about not dying. It's also about having someone else decide, in whatever decide means depending on the species, that to mate with you, right? And you see, like if you want to look at like, if you want to see like an interesting example, throw on Netflix, and I think it's still on there, but there's like this documentary called Dancing Birds, or something about dancing birds, and it's all these birds doing these wild dances, and those are all just display behaviors. Those are all like trying to attract mates, these elaborate behaviors, because and you think like, why would this bird's like at risk of being attacked by other birds, it's at risk of being attacked by snakes, it's making itself super noticeable, but if it doesn't find a mate, none of the rest of the stuff matters. And it's not like the birds, see, this is the interesting question of how much are we aware of our instincts, and the answer is almost always not at all. It just is, you know, what we call drives or motivations. But it's so interesting to me to think like, where's that coming from? And it's coming from the fact that you're not the first of your species, and there's more than just things like hair color encoded in DNA, and how it affects things like behavior. Like there's monarch butterflies that are born, or their mom's not even there when they become butterflies. What's the word I'm looking for? Metamorphize or whatever. And those butterflies will have never seen their mom. They'll wait till they're like about the right size, and then they'll fly right to the same group of trees in Brazil. And it's like, how? I'm pretty sure that's monarchs. I might have messed up my butterfly species there, but I was reading about this with my daughter like just a couple days ago. She loves reading like animal fact books. She likes nonfiction, only likes nonfiction now is her big thing. So my 7-year-old. Anyways, that this idea that group behavior evolves too. This is like such a wild thought that like we're not just. I want you to kind of think of this idea of like heredity as being way more than like hair color, eye color, this kind of stuff. That it's like, and like the first step to see that. So it's okay. So the passing of physical traits is like pretty easy to understand. You got freckles from your mom, big deal. Everyone can kind of get their mind around that. We've known that for a long time, even though we haven't understood genetics. People were like, it started with actually vegetables, right? And the guy's name's Mendel, like Mendell, and he was doing experiments to see like how to make his peas better, right? And so he would take like a good pea and match it with another good pea, try to splice the genetics or make a new strain, right? And so that's all selective reproduction with focused goals, right? So there's like an applied understanding at least some level of genetics, and he knew if he mixed this with this, and you could Google Mendel and you could see how he's often credited as like talking about genetics before genetics. It's like a specific guy that was a priest gardener. I would have pulled something up about him if I knew. I would have randomly brought him up 12 minutes into my slide presentation. Sorry, I'll finish this slide up and we'll keep going here. Nature and nurture influences. So but that point was significant, right? That like even before they understood that deoxyribonucleic acid DNA is like in your actual cells, they knew that obviously kids sometimes look like their parents. There has to be a connection between father and son, mother and daughter. And I'll kind of break this down because it's complicated how it works. So I have some videos to help me today. Nature and nurture influence each other. Okay, this by this time should be something that you've heard me say a bunch of times, that you're not your nature or your nurture. You're a human being in a world. The human being part is your nature. The world part is your environment, your nurture. They're in a complicated interplay. It says there, it's like there's different influences, there's different types of people, there's different groups of people. But when I say groups of people, I'm talking at a smaller level. This whole kind of current idea of like, oh, this group of people is like super bad or super violent, and this group of people is like they're peaceful, and it's like, are we talking kindergarten level or are we talking as adults? Because as adults, we know that, good and evil runs right down the soul of each individual. Weird point to end a 14-minute slide on. I'm sorry. I'll try to keep my pace a bit better. Okay, let's keep going. So I want to make a point too of why because I've made some, especially in the last presentation, like I made this point that like we're very close. Like we're closer genetically to a chimp than a chimp is to a gorilla, and that sometimes surprises people. And then I'll sometimes throw it, just to cloud the waters a little bit, I'll throw in the point that like when I say the closest animal we are to is a chimp, I'm talking like body, right? Like even just look at that chimpanzee. Like its ankles are similar to your ankles, its knees are similar to your knees, its elbows are similar, its wrists are similar, the neck is very different, but its cardiovascular system is basically the same. Its lymphatic system is very similar. The hips have some similarities. They're not as bipedal, so the hips is actually a pretty major difference. But we'd be able to compare the difference because it's a similar concept. And what I'm just saying is like our anatomy, our actual physical body is probably the most similar to chimps as compared to anything else. But you could probably argue that dolphins are closer brain-wise. Okay. I'm going to say to you there's three things. There's three propositions. And that's a pretty cool word because that kind of means like a lot of the ideas in evolutionary developmental psychology. So I think, I don't know if I explained this word yet, but you can kind of tie it together, right? It's looking at like why these things we would talk. If we see this thing like, okay, kids start to tend to walk around 2. Why 2? Why not 1? Why not 3? It's like, okay, well, the fact that kids seem to do that, and if we look at hundreds of thousands of kids, there seems to be a pattern. And some start a bit later, or a bit earlier, or whatever. But there seems to be some consistency, or like how people tend to start puberty roughly the same time. Obviously, there's individual differences, but if you're comparing thousands of people, it's roughly the same time, almost unbelievably close to the same time. And so, if you're asking, that's kind of developmental psychology. But if you're asking the question of like, why is that the case? The big why questions, a lot of those why questions reach back into our history and were because of pressures your ancestors were under. And so, just to keep going for a sec here, a proposition means these are sort of like the 3 main points. And if you kind of see these 3 points, it'll help you sort of understand. They're my main points, my propositions. And a lot of the rest of the theory sort of comes from that. And number 1 is this idea that childhood matters. And childhood matters very specifically in terms of brain development. And I'll give you a contrast animal. If you look at a deer, okay, so a deer is born, falls out, the mom helps lick away like the placenta or whatever. The baby eventually, is weak for like a couple hours or whatever, eventually can stand up. And within that first day, it can start to move and run. And if a baby deer needed 9 months, or not 9 months, let's say 2 years before it could walk, every baby deer would get killed by wolves. So it needs to be able to run right away. The cost of needing to run right away is incredibly limited brain development. So like the cognitive ability of a wolf compared to a deer is laughable. And if a deer outruns a wolf, it's not because of brain power, it's because of instinct. It's because of the millions of deers before it that have ran away from wolves, and that how deeply that's stamped into its instinct. So anyways, I'm making this point that like, whereas you look at humans or you look at dolphins, orcas will stay with their mom in nature. An orca will stay with its mom until the mom dies. That's how strong the mom-baby relationship is. And that's why it's so devastating to rip apart orca pods for whatever. I won't go down that rant. But it is. Childhood allows for more brain development. You could look at this whole pregnancy, the whole reason. If human babies were born with bigger heads, more moms would be lost in pregnancies. If they were born with smaller heads on average, we would be limited in our cognitive development. It's almost like everything from the hips of the woman to the size of the baby's head to the length of pregnancy to the length of childhood is all about having kids with as strong of a computer in their head as possible, right? That this cognitive development and childhood, how long childhood is, this protected period of play, is related to brain development. And it's how we learn about complex societies. And it gives us time, and it protects our survival. So you'll notice in all of the creatures that have these extended childhoods, whether we're talking about wolves or whether we're talking about elephants or whether we're talking about dolphins and orcas. Orcas are dolphins, but all of these animals, you'll notice that the parental mother behavior, even to a less extent bears are hard to fit into this, but the mothers will play a massive role in violently protecting that kid, right? Like it's like they say the most dangerous animal in the world is like a tiger protecting her cub. A female tiger, even though a male tiger is stronger, a female tiger protecting cubs under threat is actually more dangerous because she's in all or nothing mode. And that's a dangerous way to encounter a tiger, obviously, right? Or in North America, the more that, and I keep getting these emails that you guys keep getting them on your campus, but like a mother bear, right? Why you never go near a baby bear, even if it looks cute, because you don't know if just around that tree the mother is taking you as a threat to that baby's life. And that's not a way you want to get characterized by a bear. Okay. Yeah, and I just put, I don't know why I have to put, there's us and there's them, right? And the reason here is like, look at how the length of so this has like a lemur and a rhesus monkey and a gibbon and a chimp and an orangutan and a gorilla, and it shows that like how the brain size relative to the amount of time spent in a juvenile period. Play and brain development go together. Thought you'd find that last video pretty interesting. Right, where it shows that like the elephant's brain's actually, there's a bigger size to brain size ratio, and it actually, or not necessarily ratio, but I think it was saying that it has like more actual brain cells, but it doesn't have the same amount of cerebral cortex. It doesn't have the same amount of the highest end processor. It's like the computer component comparison would be like it has a bigger hard drive but not as much RAM. And if you're into computers, you get that. And if you're not, it basically, I'm saying it's not just like power, it's also like operating system that matters. That humans actually evolved. So this is interesting. I hope you find this interesting. Domain specific. That means that a human brain didn't just, as it was, and I'm trying to get you to think of like humans over time having babies, having babies, having babies, those babies having babies, those babies having babies, and like how over thousands and thousands of generations the brain is being molded by the experiences of all these generations. And this is what it means when it says that evolution is where I say like model specific or domain specific, right? That it's domain means situation specific. It's like it's evolving to deal with the pressures it's under. The brain's fantastically amazing. It's amazing that that's the situation. That it's almost like whether it's nature or God or however you make sense of it, that the human brain was designed or evolved in a way that like allowed it to survive an absolutely unpredictable amount of situations. And we'll get into some of the interesting things about that even within development, like how a baby's born with the ability to speak any language, right? And they actually start to make the small sounds of all the different languages, like the phonemes or like just the sounds associated with pronunciation. But then as they start to learn a specific language like English, that they lose that capacity to go any direction. But that does imply that if you were to take, say, my daughter when she was a baby, and for whatever reason, say if I moved to Egypt and had her completely surrounded by Egyptians, she would learn Egyptian. And she would learn it easily. And she would learn it just as easily as she learned English. Or she wouldn't have learned English in that example, right? But the idea is like, it's the exact same baby. That baby living in Canada where I live, she learns English. If we had have immediately moved to Egypt, she would have immediately learned, or not immediately, but she would have learned Egyptian just as easily. It's like the baby's born with the ability to have a fluent language. One. Now, I'm just using this as an example. There's an interesting scenario when people are raised in bilingual families. That's sort of a unique difference, and kids can develop two core languages. Usually only in like a real immersive scenario. So like if like literally there's like I can think of my cousin is, or my nephew is a good example, Milo, because he has his dad's French and his mom, who's my wife's sister, is English. So he gets like he goes to a French immersion school, but most of his cousins are English. He's probably an interesting case study as somebody that's almost as fluent in both. But that's not, that's very hard to recreate if it's not from day one. So just the idea that the brain is able to learn the language it's presented, it's like, that's almost like endlessly fascinating. It's not a one mind fits all. That the mind is this like specialized module, it's this specialized system that is responding to, I say they're like historically and culturally repeated situations. Your brain detects patterns and it interprets patterns, and in a lot of ways you're a pattern interpreter, and your brain has tried to avoid things that hurt you and sometimes not to your benefit anymore, right? Like think of things like PTSD, when somebody gets really hurt in some situation and then it gets so hard stamped into their emotional system that even memories or anything that triggers that in the future creates an in the moment stress disorder, right? That's the SD in PTSD. It's after the trauma, a stress disorder. And so you could look at that as a problem, but you could also look at that as it's like a good thing gone bad. It's like the brain doesn't want you to do something that hurt you again. And so it's slamming you with, in this specific case, intrusive visual flashbacks that are hypersensitizing you to anything that could be like that. Now, that can also be like almost paralyzing and massively interfere with your daily life. And when it's not literally keeping you out of threat, it's just interfering with your data function. And that's why we put the word disorder at the end of PTSD. It's a disorder in the way that it's interfering with you living your life. It's not unexplainable. It's basically your internal threat detection system stamping something as, let's never have this happen again. And then that having a ripple effect through your emotional system. So anyways, I'll talk more about PTSD at a different time, but I just wanted to kind of throw that out there, that it's not like humans just had this brain that was at 10%, and then as we got closer to today, it just gets closer and closer to 100%. It's like, no, it's like we've been continually adapting to situations. And from a stand back perspective, it's not like every single thing I do affects how my baby's brain's going to be, although, again, I should be careful with my words because your experiences do somewhat pass on. And I'm gonna talk about that too in this whole concept of behavioral genetics. So I said I'd be quicker with this slide, and then wasn't really, but I hope you find this kind of interesting. So I want to read this to you quick. Many of our evolved psychological mechanisms are domain specific and apply only to a specific aspect of a person's psychological makeup. According to evolutionary psychology, the mind's not a general purpose device that can be applied equally to a vast array of problems. So it's not like generalized intelligence. It's actually like, well, it is, but it didn't just evolve to handle whatever, it evolved with the ability to be shapeable to the current demands of the situation. And that's what the word adapt means. Instead, our ancestors dealt with certain reoccurring problems, such as needing to hunt, protect themselves, find shelter, and so therefore specialized modules evolved that process information related to these problems. For example, there's a specialized module, might include a module for physical knowledge of tracking animals, a module for mathematical knowledge for trading with others, a module for language, module meaning like a part of the brain that does this, a part of the brain that does this, a part of the brain that does this. That because we kept being put in these repeated situations that made these demands on us, it became useful. The people that had those abilities were more likely to be successful, more likely to reproduce. And as this happens again and again and again and again and again, it's this selection for the skills that are associated with survival. And that's what natural selection is. It's this nature selecting. Natural and nature are the same word. It's nature selecting certain things. The specific time period and place is privileging certain things, right? Like in times of war, people that can not get stressed out when aggression levels go up is an advantage. In times of peace, it's a disadvantage. So this and is related to stress disorders. So it's like the same thing that can be a positive can be a negative in a different environment, because the fit in that environment won't be as good, and you won't be the most likely to survive when your fit's not good. So again, I'm just trying to kind of break down the terminology. You look at that bowl of candy and like how attractive does that look, right? It's like for your ancestors, finding things like sugar and salt were difficult. You can look at like these ibex, these like mountain goat things that like they'll climb the sheer sides of cliffs at ways that are almost unbelievable they're not falling, so that they can find these deposits of salt, because they need salt to actually, salt's like super important for your body, and obviously like having too much salt can be a problem, but having no salt you would die. Salt's important for a lot of the chemical reactions that happen in your body, right? And so because of that, and let me just go on a weird rant, but because salt is so key for survival, your body rewards you when you eat salt. And that's been the case for humans forever. And that's the same reason why you might like chips, right? It's the same reason why you might like different kinds of, why you might like a Coca-Cola, because Coca-Cola is like tons of salt. You just don't taste it because of all the sugar. But like, and they've created the perfect drink, right? It quenches thirst and makes you more thirsty. And that's on purpose chemistry. But the idea is that just because that motivation towards needing sugar and salt, because obviously now you could go to the shortstop and with $20 buy more sugar than your ancestors would have probably seen in their whole life, you know, get 20 Mars bars or whatever. And it's like, now what do we do in this scenario? It's like that desire towards sugar and towards salt is actually something some of us struggle with, right? It's like my you know, you can, if I can flip the camera and you can see sitting over by the TV, I got a half finished bag of barbecue chips over there. It's like part of that's the part of my brain that loves salt. Why salt? Well, because it was valued. Evolved mechanisms are not always adaptive in our current society. Some behavior, I just have a little bit written on the side here. Some behaviors that were adapted for our prehistoric ancestors may not serve us well today. For example, in times of food scarcity or not having enough, that was experienced by our ancestors would have led to the human propensity to gorge when food is available. So this idea of like wanting to eat it when it's there, which now can lead to overeating, which to our ancestors would have been totally normal, because see, now if we overeat and then we go back upstairs, there's like more stuff to eat like that and more stuff. But if we're, you know, in this hunter-gatherer scenario and stumbling across things sometimes, or making a big kill, and then you can eat, and then it's maybe a few lean days. So with this trait that helped our ancestors could actually be like one of the main issues around things like obesity today. And so that's that point that old reward systems can become maladaptive, can actually hurt adaptation, can become like a negative. So sometimes I like to do this when I'm like presenting an idea, then I'll try to like to steel man the other side of the argument, like what's some of the critique against it, because as you can maybe tell, I'm sort of a fan of evolutionary developmental psychology. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and I think it's part of the story. I don't think it's the whole story. And I think the critique is that it got very one-sided. There was this time period, especially around the turn of the century, like around 2000 and stuff, when like everyone wanted to learn about developmental psych. It was, I mean, evolutionary psych. It was like, I remember being at University of Waterloo at that time and that being like the cool class. It was like so fascinating. Oh, we're doing things because of how our ancestors did things. And one of the big critics of this whole approach was someone you might have heard of named Albert Bandura, who you've heard as like being the Bobo doll experiments. Operational learning was his big idea, that we learn from seeing other people. And he thought that, like, well, I'll just read this. One of the criticisms comes from the cognitive theorist Albert Bandura. He acknowledged that there's an important influence that evolution can have on human adaptation. However, he rejected what he was calling one-sided evolutionism, that just it's the answer for everything, which sees social behavior as just the product of these evolved biological characteristics. Bandura suggested as an alternative a more bidirectional view, like it says up there, in which the environment and biological conditions influence each other. So he's like basically trying to make this nature and nurture argument that, yeah, evolution is on the nurture side, just like genetics are. I mean, the nature side, it's saying what you are as a species, but then your upbringing and your parenting and all that stuff still matters. He's like, let's not throw out all that kind of stuff, like all the nurture side of the debate. So I'll read that sentence again. Bandura suggested as an alternative a bidirectional view in which environmental and biological conditions influence each other. In this view, evolutionary pressures created changes in the biological structures that allowed us to use tools, which enabled our ancestors to manipulate their environment, constructing new environmental conditions. In turn, those new environments led to new pressures. So he's saying, like, it's not just evolution, it's also that what we do changes our situation, and changing our situation, like inventing something like social media, changes the pressures on people. And in turn, environmental innovations can produce new selection pressures. So he's just basically saying it's more back and forth. Evolution gives us bodily structures, biological potential, not behavior. Question mark, question mark, question mark. Because I'm trying to kind of hint at this idea of like, or does it affect behavior? And we are going to talk about like the Minnesota Twins studies and this idea of behavioral genetics, right? It's easier to see how like our inheritance affects, and I've made this point a couple times, like things like hair color or even biological potential, like maybe IQ. But how does it affect things like how we actually behave or how we parent ourselves or things like that? And then that big point at the bottom is, you know, it only takes mice a few weeks before they can have their own babies, and then they can have their own babies, and then they can have their own babies, and they can have their own babies. So I just said that like within 1 year you could have like whatever 10 generations, whereas like for humans to even have 4 generations, like me, my parents, my grandparents, my great grandparents, that's like maybe 100 years. So human evolution, just because of the length of our lifetime, is much slower than other animals. So it's very difficult to see how evolution plays a role with humans. Right, so it's just harder to measure. If you have something like finch birds, or like I was saying there with mice, you just see it more dramatically. You can almost have experimental conditions that create certain evolved characteristics. Evolution needs time. Okay, I'll try this slide again. I just presented this whole slide and then realized I wasn't recording. So okay, I shouldn't refer back to it because you didn't see it. So it's a gene, right? That the gene is this segment of DNA. It's a piece of the DNA that has, there's something like 23,000 genes, pieces of DNA that have information on it that direct how the cells in your body work, how they like reproduce, and how they manufacture proteins. And manufacture proteins, what I mean by that is like proteins are the building blocks of like basically everything. So it's how the DNA, when I say that DNA is directing your development, what does it mean? Well, it's actually like affecting how your cells are reproducing, and it's affecting how your proteins are building those into different things. So it's like actually affecting your construction at the most core level. That these genetic traits are retained in our DNA to be transferred to new generations. That like it's just like you're influenced by the people in your past, it's like you're going to influence the people in the future if you have kids and if they have kids, and right, if you're part of the genetic inheritance of someone, you'll eventually be somebody else's ancestors, and so the life you live matters too. DNA is inherited from all the species that came before. Now this is where we dip deep into prehistory. I'm like scrambling between if I want to go super hard on that point, because what would that mean? Obviously, like people from two different parts of the world, the break in their family tree is going to go way back, but we're reaching way back into prehistory, and we find that human DNA is actually very similar. That actually, if we were to lay out our DNA beside each other, like 99% of it would be the same. And I don't need to know where you're from in the world before saying that. I don't need to know anything about you. Everything that's different between people is in that 1%, which is a pretty wild thing to think about. So now, think how wild this is. I'd like you to have this in your note, please. We begin life as a single cell, weighing about 1/20 millionth of an ounce. So if you were to write this as math, you'd say, okay, 1 ounce, and you'd put a line on top of the one, and you'd have to put 20 million on the top of an ounce. It's so small, and yet it contains all the genetic information. Each cell houses the entire genetic code. Each cell of your body has your entire genetic code. That orchestrates, that's a good word, right? The orchestrator is the person at the front that's like telling everyone what to do, that orchestrates growth from the single cell of a person, from a single cell to a person made up of trillions of cells. So that very first cell, there was a point when you were just one cell, and that cell had within it all the information it needed for you to, become a full person made up of trillions of cells. And how all that cell division and duplication and everything happens, we're going to get into. Each individual cell contains a replica of the original code. So every cell in your body, every one of the trillions of cells in your body, has to trace back to that first single cell. And like, imagine going back 200 years and trying to just explain this to a random person who hadn't heard of cells and DNA and proteins and all this stuff, right? You'd sound like you're talking about magic. It is pretty mind-blowing. It's just that we've become used to talking about it like that single cell has the coding information for the entire organism. The nucleus of each human cell contains 46 chromosomes. Okay, so there's 46 chromosomes. Sometimes all those chromosomes though exist in pairs. So they're basically like X's. I'll show a picture on the next slide. And so sometimes you hear it presented as 23 chromosome pairs. 23andMe. Why is it called 23andMe if you've ever heard of that? Like genetic testing thing. It's because, well, you have 23 pairs of chromosomes, which is the same as saying 46 individual ones, I guess. So if you were to take a microscope and actually look in the blood, and you could actually, okay, so the nucleus of each cell, so the middle part of each cell, that where the action's happening contains the chromosomes, right? Which is what you're looking at here. They're these things that look like almost like a rope or like thread or whatever, thread-like structure made up of DNA. So it's actually made up of, think of DNA as, even just look at that word, an acid. What's an acid? It's basically a liquid, right? And this chromosome, so DNA is this complex model, has a double helix shape and spiral staircase. I'll show you that on the next slide. But I want you to kind of see this, right? That if you were to actually look inside, you would see that all this DNA is actually on all these tangled threads. And why it's so tangled is because it allows for so much surface area in such a small space. So all you need to really write down is just chromosomes are thread-like structures made up of DNA. So then when you hear someone say the word genome, you might have said, like, you heard someone say the human genome. They're kind of combining the words like genetics and chromosome, genome. They're just kind of meaning both. So cracking the human genome would mean figuring out what it actually says on these, like what this information and I keep using the word information, but it's not obviously like numbers or words. It's inside the body, but what the order, the sequence, they call it genetic sequencing, the sequence of the chemicals is what's important. So this one and chapter 7, when I talk about puberty, are probably the most biology heavy. The next presentation will be getting into like infancy, and I'll be talking much more what you maybe would suspect developmental psychology is, but this is the step before. So if you look at, okay, I want to explain just a few things here with a picture. So a helix is that if you look at that DNA picture on the left, you can kind of see it as like a staircase going up. It's like that's what a double helix means. It means like a figure 8 kind of pattern. DNA is this complex molecule that has this double helix, this like, if you just look at the blue lines in the picture, how it looks like kind of, I'm using the term figure 8, double helix and figure 8, sort of the same. And that's where it contains all this genetic information. You've probably seen a picture like that, but I thought it was just good for explaining this double helix concept. Okay, try 3. Keep like, I recorded this and I didn't press it the last click, so this box on the top left corner didn't come up. And that's like, just a big warning to you, if you're recording in PowerPoint and you don't record all your points, it like always messes up. So yeah, just put that point that like a genome is a combo of those two words, gene and chromosome. Genes are short segments of DNA, and I've read this now. This will be my third time, so but you haven't heard it yet. That scientists originally thought that there was about 100,000 genes, and one of the big surprises from the Human Genome Project was that it was a lot lower. They figured it was about 30,000, and more recent research is looking at how it's probably closer to like about, I have there 20,700. So that means that if we could figure out what each of those genes does, one of them maybe is related to something like if you have freckles or not, and one of them is related to if you have dimples, all these things, if we could figure out what each of those 20,700 things are, we would completely understand what all the parts of your DNA is doing. That's sort of the idea. And that's what the Human Genome Project was trying to do, was trying to map it. And that idea that the word genome, I think I might have already said this, but is a combo of the words genes and chromosome. So human genome means they're trying to figure out the genetic information on the chromosomes. All human cells have 46 chromosomes arranged in 23 pairs. I think I already told you that. Now, the only time that's different is when we're talking specifically about the sex cells, the gametes, the sperm and the egg. And so I'll address those separately. Okay. So your genes work together. I have this point, right? Genes are not only collaborative, so they work together, but they're also enduring. They have long-reaching impact. Like they get past generation to generation. So I asked this question, how, okay, so we can understand there's a connection between the parent and the child, but how does it actually happen? How does this genetic information actually get passed from generation to generation? How does this actually end up in the trillions of cells in the body of a new baby? Right? And so I gotta kind of describe this, and this is all related to pregnancy, but there's sort of these three main concepts we need to cover: mitosis, meiosis, so basically cell division specifically to the testes and ovaries, and then what does it mean when when the sperm fertilizes the egg, fertilization. That these are really the three kind of core processes. I put these three processes are central to the story. So in terms of talking about something that's pretty mind-blowing, mitosis, this idea of how cells reproduce, and that the cell's nucleus, this is so wild, it basically creates a double of itself and then separates. And then each of them create another double of themselves and then separate, then another double of themselves and then separate, and then another double of themselves. So you go like 1 to 2 to 4 to 16 to whatever, 32 to 64 to 128 to 256 to whatever, right? And so that's how you get from 1 to trillions, is that once you get to 256, that's easy to do because that's the same as like memory card sizes for whatever reason, but once you get to 256, then it's like every one of those 256 are creating another one, so that's like 5 whatever, right? And then it's like, so there's more, every one is duplicating, this cell duplication and division. So it's when it says duplicates itself and divides, it means 1 becomes 2, and as it fully becomes a duplicate of itself, this line in the middle, if you can see this, you see this as almost like it looks like 2 circles that are merged together. It's like eventually they'll become their own unique circle. And when that happens, we'd say that 1 became 2. And that's actually the most magical part of you, that you were originally 1 cell that became trillions of cells. And just because we made up this word mitosis to like label it doesn't make it any less magical. 2 new cells are formed, each containing the same DNA as the original, arranged in the same 23 pairs of chromosomes. So it's a duplicate. It's duplicated and then divided. This is what's called cell division. Okay, so mitosis. So this accounts for everything except the testes and the ovaries. So the next one here, meiosis. I don't know why it auto-made me like a super small box in the bottom. But anyways, I guess I'm not blocking the picture. Meiosis only forms in the eggs and sperm cells, right? So this is, gametes means the sex cells of both male and female. So the egg and the sperm male, egg female. A cell of the testes or ovaries duplicates its chromosomes, but then divides twice. Okay, so you see it divides twice, creating 4 cells, each which has only half of the genetic information. So you see, if you look at the bottom of this picture, how this like red kind of X becomes 2 singles, and the blue X becomes 2 singles. And this splitting is setting it up for it to be recombined, like the male and female to be recombined in what we call fertilization. By the end of meiosis of this process, each of the 4 cells now has 23 unpaired chromosomes. Right? So it's like, it's so wild. It's like the cell prepares itself to be combined with something else. Again, it's the language almost gets in the way of talking about how amazing it is that this is what happens, that the body's preparing to create a new life at this stage, actually. Half of the genetic material of the parent cell, ready to merge with half of the genetic material of the other parent cell. Okay, so I have a little video coming up that just sort of goes through this and kind of tries to really highlight the difference between mitosis and meiosis.
Before we go in depth on meiosis, I want to do a very high-level overview comparing mitosis to meiosis. So in mitosis, and this is all a review if you've watched the mitosis video, in mitosis we start with a cell. We start with a cell that has a diploid number of chromosomes. I'll just write 2n to show it has the diploid number. For human beings, this would be 46 chromosomes. 46 for 46 for humans. You get 23 chromosomes from your mother, 23 chromosomes from your father, or you could say you have 23 homologous pairs, which leads to 46 chromosomes. Now, after the process of mitosis happens, and you have your cytokinesis and all the rest, you end up with 2 cells that each have the same genetic information as the original. So you now have 2 cells that each have the diploid number of chromosomes. So 2n and 2n. And now each of these cells are just like this cell was. It can go through interphase again, and it grows, and it can replicate its DNA and its centrosomes and grow some more. And then each of these can go through mitosis again. And this is actually how most of the cells in your body grow. This is how you turn from a single cell organism into you, or for the most part, into you. So that is mitosis. And one way to think about it, it's a cycle. After each of these things go through mitosis, they can then go through the entire cell cycle again. And let me write this a little bit neater. Mitosis. That S was a little bit hard to read. Now, what happens in meiosis? What happens in meiosis? I'll do that over here. In meiosis, something slightly different happens. And it happens in 2 phases. So you will start with a cell that has a diploid number of chromosomes. So you will start with a cell that has a diploid number of chromosomes. And in its interphase, it also replicates its DNA. And then it goes through something called meiosis 1. And in meiosis 1, what you end up with is 2 cells that now have a haploid number of chromosomes. So you end up with 2 cells. You now have 2 cells that each have a haploid number of chromosomes. So you have N and you have N. So if we're talking about human beings, you have 46 chromosomes here, and now you have 23 chromosomes in this nucleus, and now you have 23 nucleus, but you're still not done. Then each of these will then go through a phase, which I'll talk about in a second, which is very similar to mitosis, which will duplicate this entire cell into two. So actually, let me do it like this. So now this one, you're going to have four cells that each have the haploid number of chromosomes. And they all don't necessarily have the same genetic information anymore. Because as we go through this first phase right over here of meiosis, and this first phase where you go from diploid to haploid, right over here, this is called meiosis 1. Meiosis 1. You're essentially splitting the homologous pairs, and so this one might get some of the ones that you originally got from your father, and some of the ones that you originally got from your mother, some of the ones that you originally got from your father, some of the ones that you originally got from your mother. They split randomly, but each homologous pair gets split up, and then in this phase, meiosis 2. So this phase right over here is called meiosis 2. It's very similar to mitosis, except you're now dealing with cells that start off with the haploid number. And it's important to realize meiosis is not a cycle. These cells that you have over here, these are gametes. These are sex cells. These are gametes. These can now be used in fertilization. If we're talking about if you're male, this is happening in your testes, and these are going to be sperm cells. If you are female, this is happening in your ovaries, and these are going to be egg cells. If you are a tree, this could be pollen, or it could be an ovule. So these are used for fertilization. These will fuse together in sexual reproduction to get to a fertilized egg, which then can undergo mitosis to create an entirely new organism. So not a cycle here, although I guess once these will find sex cells from another organism and fuse with them, and then those can turn into another organism, and I guess the whole circle of life starts again. But it's not the case with mitosis, where this could just keep on going and going and going. This cell is just like this cell, while these sex cells are different than this one right over here. Now, where does this happen in the body? And we've talked about this in previous videos. These are your somatic cells right over here. These are the ones that make up the bulk of your body, somatic cells. And where is this happening? Well, this is happening in germ cells. As we mentioned, if you're male, it's in your testes, and if you're female, it's in your ovaries. And germ cells actually can undergo mitosis to produce other germ cells that have a diploid number of chromosomes, or they can undergo meiosis in order to produce sperm or egg cells, in order to produce gametes.
Okay, so this is called a zygote, and this is interesting, right? The egg and the sperm fuse to create a single cell. This is kind of the earliest version of human life. Egg and sperm each contribute 23 of the unpaired chromosomes to form a set of 23 paired, so 46. Chromosomes are not the exact copy of the parent's DNA. This is interesting. It's like because there's a mixing, and because DNA is a copy but not an exact copy, sometimes there's mixing differences, which in a simple way is why if you have a sister, you're not the exact same as your sister. It's even if you have the same parents, the recombination is not necessarily the exact same. Right, and I think I went on a long rant about how, like, with bunnies, that's the whole idea that the more differences in offspring increases the likelihood that at least one of the offspring has the right attributes to survive, the right fit for an environment. Okay, so I got just a quick video here on the fertilization process.
In this video then we'll look at the beginning of development, looking into the ovary at an unfertilized egg. It then gets fertilized by sperm, which travel down the fallopian tube. So here, millions of sperm coming along, Several of them will hit the egg and try to penetrate it, but one will win, as it were, go into the nucleus, and then there's a reprogramming process where the male and female nuclei have their genes set aside to be turned on and off for early development. Here you see early cleavage stages occurring, and this is one of the early growth phases. As the embryo moves down the fallopian tube, it's going to form an important stage called the blastocyst here in a few seconds. Of course, in real life, that takes days, about 5 days. At this stage, then, I'd like to draw your attention to the inside of the blastocyst, where there are cells called the inner cell mass, which I'll be abbreviating as ICM. Those are the cells that make the entire animal, and the outer cells give rise to the placenta and other supporting tissues. At this stage, the embryo implants into the wall of the uterus. This is when a pregnancy is really initiated. And now we'll see those blue inner cell mass cells form a disc, and then as the cells continue to grow, they change their physical positions, their kind of geographical relationship to one another. And you'll see that represented here as this disc gets transformed into an embryo. Those lines represent sites where cells are migrating in and out. And here's an important stage when the 3 beginning layers of the embryo, the so-called germ layers, are formed, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. As development proceeds, there's more growth and movement of cells. It'll begin to form a neural tube. Here it turns, and appendages start to bud out. You see the head forming and the eye. And then eventually we get a small embryo, and some months later, of course, this would be born as a young baby.
So the genotype, this includes the totality of a person's genetic makeup. So this is like the information that's on the genes, what you're more susceptible to, what you might have more, I say longevity genes, like it's kind of like the opposite of the word susceptible. It's basically all the coding, right? All the coding. Here, I have something I want to read here. That's why I said that word twice, because I was just getting this ready. The differences between that and then this next word, phenotype. So that's like what the coding actually does. So you have your genotype, which is like what type, remember the word type just means what type of genes. So what does the gene actually say? And then phenotype, or what type of observable phenomena. So is your hair like actually red, or is it blonde, or what do you actually see? What physical characteristics like height and weight and hair color, and even psychological characteristics like personality and intelligence. So the idea is that the genotype is what the code says. Or like if we could map out your entire DNA, we would see that there's coding for certain things, and then we would actually see those things as like your hair color and your freckles and your dimples or whatever. Those are the phenotypes. So it's kind of like the genotype is the code, and the phenotype is what the code does, would be a way to think of it. Phenotype consists of observable characteristics. For each genotype, there's a range of potential phenotypes. So say the genotype is like your hair color, then there's certain information there. But that phenotype could be like blonde, red, brown, black. Bald, right? So it's like there's the information, the genotype, and then what that information does in expressed observable characteristics. Okay. So an allele, just quick. So like say if you could have like brown eyes or blue eyes, those are 2 different alleles. They're a variant of a given gene. So if the mom has blue eyes and the dad has brown eyes, usually the kid will have brown eyes. Not always, usually. But not just 51% of the time, more like 80 or 90% of the time. So much so that brown seems to win out over blue in a dominant way. This is where the language comes from, right? It's the dominant of the two, just like darker hair is dominant of blonder hair. Now, so recessive means to stand behind. So what that means is usually if mom has, or if one partner has brown eyes and one has blue, the brown eyes will usually win. It's the dominant in that combination. It doesn't always win, but it usually does. The recessive refers to the one that usually loses in that situation. And what's interesting is almost all genes that are a result of a copying match, right? So when the genetic material is copied from one parent to the child, if there's an error in how that copying is done, a copying mistake, another word for that is a mutation. And most of those kind of mutations become recessive. So that's interesting that like if there's some kind of mistake and a gene's passed on, that gene almost always will lose out in the next round, which is like, again, like almost like a fail-safe that nature's building in. Like if this goes wrong, this is how it corrects on a long-term scale, which again is pretty mind-blowing. So the biological sex difference between male and females is located on the 23rd of the 23 chromosomes. You see it here. You see this as XY, right? If it's XY, it's male, and if it's 2X, then it's female. Women have 2 pairs of X genes in their pair. If one even mutates, there's still a backup copy, whereas males have 1X, 1Y. So simple things like nothing super simple, but even things like blood type, things like thinness or thickness of hair, that's more like a single gene affects that. But we've known for a long time that for more complex things, that there's few things that are actually just determined by one gene. Usually it's by a combination of genes, right? And this is what this word polygenetic inheritance. You inherit your genes from your parents. You've heard the word inheritance before. Polygenetic just means multiple genes. So there's multiple genes affecting the thing, right? So if we're talking about something like intelligence or sense of humor, it's not one gene, it's a combination of multiple genes. Another way of saying that, it's polygenetic. So inherited characteristics are mostly determined by the interaction of different genes from our ancestors. And this is why there's so much complexity, and it's a different interaction of different genes in different people. It's not as simple as one doing one. Although that is the case sometimes. This is kind of my point. Some simple things are controlled by basically one gene does this, but usually it's a group of genes that are contributing to something. And that word for that is polygenetic. When you look at these two guys, what's the first thing you notice, right? It's like you could probably have tricked me and had them switch shirts and switch positions and I wouldn't have noticed, right? They're like, they look basically as close as you can look. And it's like, I'm going to talk for a second here about twins. That what is this nature nurture? Because one of the interesting things looking at these two guys is like, if they're identical twins, their nature or their genetic material is going to be as close as any two humans can be, right? Like identical twins, they literally split from the same cell. But then it's interesting to see how behavior, so this word here, behavior genetics, this is a field of study that is looking at how heredity and development and the environment affect the actual traits of people. What would be more interesting is if you found that these guys hadn't seen each other for a long time, but they had lived in similar ways, right? It's almost like the behavior part would be more mind-blowing than that they just look the same. That there's environmental influences, both psychological and physical, and it can also change the functioning of genes we inherit at birth. That this is just saying that like the environment influences how your genes are expressed, and that some of that's actually physical, like in terms of like if there's allergens or radiation in your environment, but some of that's also like psychological, like the parenting and family situation you're born into affects how your nature is nurtured. You have a behavioral genetics, trying to look at this idea is there things similar between twins that are more than just physical characteristics? This leads us to the Minnesota twin studies. In 1979, researchers led by Thomas Bouchard of the University of Minnesota invited to Minnesota genetically identical twins from all around the world who had been separated at birth. To discover their similarities and differences in characteristics and personality, intelligence, and behavior, the participating twins completed personality and intelligence tests, provided detailed medical histories, and were asked many questions about their family and childhood, their personal interests, their academic abilities, their family lives, their work orientation, their values, their aesthetic judgments, so basically like all their preferences. A striking example from this study was the Jim twins. Okay, so I want you to think about this. So these are two twins that were separated at birth. Jim Springer and Jim Lewis were separated at 4 weeks of age and didn't see each other again until they were 39. So they didn't see each other for like almost 40 years. Not only did their adoptive parents weirdly name them both Jim, but both grew up with dogs named Toy. Both of them married and divorced women named Betty. Amazingly, too, James named his son James Allen, and the other named his son James Allen, also the same. The only difference is the one Allen has 2 L's in the name, but basically the same. So now, and there's more about those Jims. It's like they're an interesting study. If you just look up like the Jim brothers and the Minnesota twin studies, you'll find more about it. But look at the title of that book, right? Born Together but Raised Apart, or reared. Child rearing is a word that they used to always use. But we could say that nowadays is like born together, but like raised apart. It's kind of poetic ending to this point. While one can debate the role that coincidence plays in such a story, it's hard to argue that genes played no part. It's as if the genes sing a prehistoric song that today should be sometimes resisted, oh darn, I messed it up. The genes sing a prehistoric song that today should sometimes be resisted, but which would be foolish to ignore. Yeah, so basically it's like, it's not the whole story, but it'd be foolish to pretend like it's not at least a significant part of it. So the next idea, oh, I forgot to turn the camera back on. Okay, well, on the next slide. Epigenetics, the study of changes in organisms caused by the modification of gene expression rather than actual modification of the gene code. So what's that saying? It's saying that like actually you have genetic information, but your environment can affect how that is expressed. Right? So like you might have a sensitivity towards some chemical that would result in a really bad allergy, but if you grow up in a scenario where that chemical is not present, it's not going to trigger that. So the environment can affect the genes also. It's this bidirectional view idea that heredity affects the environment, but then at the bottom there, it's this idea of like the environment also affects heredity, which is why the arrow is like dual facing. Heredity and the environment contributions are not additive. They don't just like add to each other. It's more this idea of it being like some kind of, it's not like, oh, there's this over here and then this over there and they're just kind of both part of your stories. It's that they're in this dynamic interaction. It's more like they're times each other. It's like your genetic, again, this is just a different way of saying nature nurture. I want to keep stressing this, that if you understand the nature nurture conversation, that what shapes your life and your experience is partly who you are biophysically and emotionally and the whole biochemical aspect of that, and then part of your situation, your world, your environment, your parenting, your schooling, your media, all those influences on you. There's you, and then there's influences on you. You is the heredity, the influences on you is your environment. And actually, you're not just your heredity. Heredity is what you're biologically contributing. or your biological makeup, you're in a world. This is where Bandura said you almost have to view it as like heredity, environment, and behavior. And that to understand your behavior, you have to understand that you're this heredity in an environment that's behaving. And I might have lost you there, but that's that. If you followed that point, that's basically Bandura's point around his like whole social observational learning idea, is that, and I never really thought of it that way, but it's kind of wild, that you're an interaction of the interaction of yourself and your environment shapes your behavior, and your behavior also shapes those things back. That's another idea of his called the reciprocal determinism. I'm getting kind of way off point, but reciprocal determinism just means like that arrow at the bottom that's going both ways. Reciprocal means back and forth, and determinism means that one thing determines the other or influences the other. So reciprocal determinism is the idea that like you influence your world, but your world influences you. And or the other way of saying it is like if I walk into the party and everyone's mean to me, that's going to influence me. But if I walk into the party and I make like a funny joke and I'm funny, I'm part of other people's environments in that scenario, and then people like me more and are nicer towards me. So it's like I influence the environment, but then the environment also influenced me. It's just like back and forth. Bidirectional means like both directions.
Here's a conundrum. Identical twins originate from the same DNA, so how can they turn out so different, even in traits that have a significant genetic component? For instance, why might one twin get heart disease at 55 while her sister runs marathons in perfect health? Nature versus nurture has a lot to do with it, but a deeper related answer can be found within something called epigenetics. That's the study of how DNA interacts with the multitude of smaller molecules found within cells, which can activate and deactivate genes. If you think of DNA as a recipe book, those molecules are largely what determine what gets cooked when. They aren't making any conscious choices themselves. Rather, their presence and concentration within cells makes the difference. So how does that work? Genes in DNA are expressed when they're read and transcribed into RNA, which is translated into proteins by structures called ribosomes. And proteins are much of what determines a cell's characteristics and function. Epigenetic changes can boost or interfere with the transcription of specific genes. The most common way interference happens is that DNA, or the proteins it's wrapped around, gets labeled with small chemical tags. The set of all of the chemical tags that are attached to the genome of a given cell is called the epigenome. Some of these, like a methyl group, inhibit gene expression by derailing the cellular transcription machinery or causing the DNA to coil more tightly, making it inaccessible. The gene is still there, but it's silent. Boosting transcription is essentially the opposite. Some chemical tags will unwind the DNA, making it easier to transcribe, which ramps up production of the associated protein. Epigenetic changes can survive cell division, which means that they could affect an organism for its entire life. Sometimes that's a good thing. Epigenetic changes are part of normal development. The cells in an embryo start with one master genome. As the cells divide, some genes are activated and others inhibited. Over time, through this epigenetic reprogramming, some cells develop into heart cells and others into liver cells. Each of the approximately 200 cell types in your body has essentially the same genome, but its own distinct epigenome. The epigenome also mediates a lifelong dialogue between genes and the environment. The chemical tags that turn genes on and off can be influenced by factors including diet, chemical exposure, and medication. The resulting epigenetic changes can eventually lead to disease if, for example, they turn off a gene that makes a tumor-suppressing protein. Environmentally induced epigenetic changes are part of the reason why genetically identical twins can grow up to have very different lives. As twins get older, their epigenomes diverge, affecting the way they age and their susceptibility to disease. Even social experiences can cause epigenetic changes. In one famous experiment, when mother rats weren't attentive enough to their pups, genes in the babies that help them manage stress were methylated and turned off. And it might not stop with that generation. Most epigenetic marks are erased when egg and sperm cells are formed. But now, researchers think that some of those imprints survive, passing those epigenetic traits on to the next generation. Your mother's or your father's experiences as a child or choices as adults could actually shape your own epigenome. But even though epigenetic changes are sticky, they're not necessarily permanent. A balanced lifestyle that includes a healthy diet, exercise, and avoiding exposure to contaminants may, in the long run, create a healthy epigenome. It's an exciting time to be studying this. Scientists are just beginning to understand how epigenetics could explain mechanisms of human development and aging, as well as the origins of cancer, heart disease, mental illness, addiction, and many other conditions. Meanwhile, new genome editing techniques are making it much easier to identify which epigenetic changes really matter for health and disease. Once we understand how our epigenome influences us, we might be able to influence it too.
Okay. We're getting there, just a little bit more. So conception occurs when the single sperm cell from a male unites with the ovum, the egg, in a female's fallopian tube in a process called fertilization. So conception starts at fertilization. Over the next few months, the genetic code, discussed earlier, directs a series of changes in the fertilized egg. But many events and hazards will influence how that egg develops and becomes a person. Okay, so we're going to look at this kind of process. So the single egg, so this occurs at fertilization. Single sperm unites with the ovum in the female's fallopian tube. During the 3 trimesters or 3, think of like at school, you usually talk about semesters, like the year broken into 2. Trimester is an amount of time broken into 3. The genetic code directs a series of changes in the fertilized egg. Right, and I said like many events and hazards influence how that egg can develop. Like for example, one of the reasons why drinking during pregnancy is risky, maybe I'll just say, is because ethanol passes easily through the placenta. So it doesn't, what usually is a boundary protecting baby and directing kind of what gets to baby, right? Because the placenta is another thing that's absolutely wild when you think about it, how amazing it is that it's just like in between baby and mom. Baby is mom at this point, but it's this place where nutrients are transferred that allows the baby to process oxygen even though it's not breathing, that allows the baby to also dispose of waste. It's completely mind-blowing really when you actually think about it. This is the thing about this whole like topic, is that it's so normalized that we sometimes speed over it without sort of slowing down and being like it's a pretty amazing thing. That's like not an articulate way of saying it, but it's an amazing process and just aspect of humanity, the reproductive aspect. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I'll just put on points. I have to be so careful because when you're in, you should know this too if you ever use PowerPoint to record, and I recommend you do, because even if you're just doing like a project for me or something and you wanted to have some bullet points and have them on the screen, have like a picture and then record yourself in it, and it's like and you can save it as an MP4 file and upload it as a video. It's just really slick in a lot of ways, and it's good for big projects. Like when I'm making this like multi-hour video for you, I apologize in advance, but It's awesome because I can do it slide by slide, right? So if I make a mistake at like this point, I'm only redoing this slide. I'm not redoing the whole presentation, except like that time I mentioned before when I had no audio the whole time for some reason. That was a bad night. That was a bad realization at like 1 in the morning. But anyways, if you want to just write down what's on the side, and I'll kind of go over this. This rapid cell division by the zygote begins the germinal period, right? Now, when I'm saying like I'm going to say like the germinal, and then we're going to talk about the embryonic stage, like when it's an embryo, and then we're going to talk about the fetus stage, the fetal stage. Now, you'll notice right away, this is only from conception to 4 weeks, and you know that pregnancy is 9 months in general, right? On average, I guess. And so what I'm basically trying to say is these, even though they're a trimester means like taking an amount of time and breaking it into 3 sections. There was this part, and then there was this part, and then this part. But they're not all equal in time. The argument the book makes is that, and I agree with this, is that they're equal in developmental importance. So even though this is only the first 4 weeks, a lot's happening in this first 4 weeks. By the end of this first 4 weeks, we have a spinal cord, we have a nervous system, we have lungs, we have a heart, we have the entire gastrointestinal system. The embryonic sac envelops primarily tissues of the entire body. So it's like the building blocks are all there already. It's less than 0.25 centimeters. It's not even a quarter of a centimeter long. Well, it's like less than a quarter of a centimeter long. I don't think I read this yet. Rapid cell division begins the germinal period. I think I stopped here. Within 1 week after conception, the differentiation of the cells. So it means like, I'm going to talk about differentiation in just a second, but the cells are duplicating. We talked about that. But the next interesting thing that they start to do, and we'll mention this in a second, or in a few slides, is they start doing different things, right? And you can obviously say that, like obviously cells in your body, some of your cells are in your lungs, and some of your cells are in your liver, and some of your cells are neurons in your brain. And so like those cells are doing different things. What? They were all copies of the same. Those were all copies of the same that somehow knew how to, I'm going to get to this in a sec, become more copies, go certain places, which we call neuromigration, and do certain things, this differentiation thing, and then connect with each other, neuroconnectivity. It's your brain basically, I'm going to get to the brain topic in just a second, but if you look at just the brain, it's like your brain cells basically multiply, go to a spot, do the job of that spot, and then connect with each other, and that's basically building a brain. Okay, talk about getting off point. I'm going to start that sentence again. Within 1 week after conception, the differentiation of these cells, their specification for different tasks, has already begun. At this stage, the organism, which we now call the blastocyst, consists of a hollow ball of cells that will eventually develop into the embryo, and something called a trypoblast, which is an outer layer of cells which provides nutrients and supports the embryo. So what you're seeing in that picture isn't only the organism, like isn't only the what's going to be a baby, it's also the whole support system for that baby, in terms of like it's like the thing and the thing that it needs to grow, and it's an egg. That's what an egg is, right? Like an egg, if you just think about it, eggs are super interesting because eggs allowed mammals and reptiles to have, and birds to still have water births even though they're on land. And if you're interested in what I mean by that, that's maybe like a different conversation. But yeah, the egg is a fascinating thing, and it allows water births on land. This blastocyst implants, and as it gets into the uterine wall of the woman, when that plants into the wall, that is a specific instant when we say that the woman is pregnant. So implantation, the embedding of the blastocyst into the uterine wall, takes place during the 2nd week after conception. So then What's the word? The pregnancies. Oh, there's a word that's not jumping to my head, but there's a word for that. But just this idea that the women's body didn't reject it, the egg is fertilized, and now it's actually called a blastocyst, and it's actually in the wall of the uterine, which means that the biological process is about to kick up to the next notch. Okay, I ended this slide poorly, but we're going to go to the second stage. Oh, yeah, I got lost on, I didn't finish this point before where I got just talking about how to record in PowerPoint. But the point I was going to make is if I put all the way down to coordinated movements, because I can see over here like what the next point's going to be, and as soon as it switches to the next slide, then I know I'm good, because if you, I think I already told you this, but if I was to press right arrow one more time, it would flip to the next slide and it would mess up this recording. And if I don't do it enough, and I only put to like the fingernails point, and then I stop my recording thinking I'm done, but there's another point, that's going to mess up the video too. And I've just done that so many times that I'm like hypersensitive to it. Okay, so the next 16-week period is, well, basically 4 months, is this embryonic period where we would call the developing baby an embryo. It's approximately 14 centimeters at the beginning of this, weighing about like 12 grams. I don't know why that was so hard for me to say. Has a strong heartbeat at this time. You're starting to see what very much looks like a baby in process. I'm going to show you a video, but you're seeing this like thin, transparent skin. The baby's completely covered with this, what's called downy hair or langio, which is like an interesting idea, right? Likely a trace to our evolutionary past. Basically a light fur. Fingernails, toenails forming. The baby's starting to move around, coordinate. So I'm just going to read to you for a sec. That was just the points. I just want you to kind of have the points, and then some of the written stuff I have is just to kind of explain it, the same idea, but maybe a little bit differently or a little more completely. The embryonic period of prenatal development occurs from 2 to 8 weeks after conception. During this embryonic period, the rate of cell differentiation intensifies. So remember, cell differentiation sounds like a huge idea. It just means, focus on the second word, differentiation. Different. It's the same word as different. It just means cells start doing different things. You do this, you do this. It's like we're playing pickup basketball. We don't all guard the same person, right? You guard this person, you guard this person, you guard this person. We're all doing our different jobs. We're differentiating. During the embryonic period, the rate of cell differentiation intensifies. Support systems for the cells start to form into things like organs. So this is called, I think I have the word here, but it's like organogenesis. Yeah, organogenesis. So it's just the word organ with an O in the middle, and then genesis, meaning beginning. So it's written as one word, like organogenesis, but it just means the time when like you're starting to see the formation of things that we call organs. The mass of cells is now called an embryo, and 3 layers. There's 3 layers. You don't necessarily need to know this, but it's interesting. There's what's called the endoderm, which is the inner layers of cells, right? That's going to become some of the most important core parts of the baby. Basically, its digestive system and its lungs. Then there's something called an ectoderm, which means the more surface layer. And that's going to become things like, again, this is so mind-blowing. This is going to become things like ears, eyes, nose, the skin, the hair. And then there's what's called the mesoderm. So DERM is the end of all these. One's like endoderm, like ENDODERM. This isn't going to be on the test, but this is just for you to know. Ectoderm, which is like etc., like ECTODERM, and that's the outermost layer. I could just put this on me spelling it out loud. It's brutal, but and then mesoderm is the layer in between. And I haven't explained this yet. So this is eventually going to become things like the circulatory system, the bones, the muscles, everything around the excretory systems, everything around the reproductive system. So everything around like going to the bathroom, everything around reproduction. This whole process of organ formation is called organogenesis. While these organs are being formed, they're especially sensitive to environmental influences like alcohol. As the embryo's 3 layers form, its life-supporting system is also developing rapidly, and this includes the umbilical cord, right, and the amnion, which is like a bag or an envelope that contains this clear fluid that in which the embryo develops. Like this is, I think I'm saying that word right, but it's to me so wild that the baby's not just the baby, but it's also the baby and the specific life support system that baby needs to develop, which again is the same as an egg. The amniotic fluid, the amnion, and then the amniotic fluid. So it's the fluid in it. The amnion is the bag that contains the amniotic fluid. Okay, that makes sense. Just the amnion by itself, that word threw me for some reason. But amniotic fluid provides an environment that is temperature, humidity controlled, as well as shock proof. The umbilical cord, which typically contains 2 arteries and 1 vein, connects the baby to the placenta. So the baby is like hardwired to this gel-like placenta that's like this in-between between mom and baby's biology. It's so intense and wild. And I keep using the word wild. Well, it's interesting because wild and nature kind of go together. It is just, when I was growing up, the wild kingdom and nature basically meant the same thing. Wild is just like, it's mind-blowing how that's the case, that's how it is, that it's that intricate, that specific. The placenta consists of this like disc-shaped group of tissues in which small blood vessels from the mother and the offspring intertwine but don't join. Again, blood vessels from mom and baby are interacting but not mixing up. They're staying unique. Very small molecules like oxygen, water, salt, and nutrients from the mom's blood, as well as things like carbon dioxide and digestive waste, pass from the baby and mom back and forth. Things like waste only pass in the one direction. It's just on that list. Larger molecules can't pass through the placenta wall as a form of protection. But this is also why alcohol is so dangerous to a baby, as ethanol has been shown experimentally to pass through the human placenta. It's important to note that the mechanism that governs the transfer of substances across the placenta is complex. Like it's like what lets things through the placenta, or how, because it's not like the placenta has its own intelligence making decisions, but why some things get through and some things don't is still not completely understood even in 2023. So then the final 4+ months of pregnancy is when the child is in what's called the fetal stage. Okay, so at this time the size is getting much bigger. The size is now 36 to 43 centimeters. Again, this is obviously babies are different sizes. Weight anywhere from 1,100 to 1,400 grams. They're adding a lot of body fat at this time. So it's so interesting, right? That what basically gets, and I guess this makes sense, but what gets formed first is the core stuff, the systems. And then it's add size, basically. The baby starts to get more active. It starts to actually, when I say rudimentary breathing, it means it's not breathing, obviously. It's in a liquid-filled sac. It can't breathe in this scenario, but it starts to and how it knows to, or what even it knowing to would mean. This is all genetically programmed. It starts to practice things that are related to developing the chest muscles and even the throat muscles associated with breathing. This fetal period, which lasts the whole rest of the pregnancy, right? So basically, which lasts about 7 months, is the prenatal period that extends from 2 months after conception until basically pregnancy. In addition to describing prenatal development in terms of germinal, embryonic, and fetal, sometimes people use the word trimester differently to just mean sort of the first 3 months, the second 3 months, and the third 3 months. So I just wanted to kind of point that out, that if you're wondering why I'm doing it this way, this is kind of separating pregnancy into the 3 main developmental periods: the germinal, the embryonic, and the fetal. Whereas you could also just break it into more calendar-wise, the first 3 months, second 3 months, third 3 months, which is sometimes how people talk about it. just rewatched that last slide, and it's a long one. I went on a big rant, so I don't really want to redo it, but I did kind of make a mistake about length. Just that idea that it's actually the last 7 months. I think I said 4 months of pregnancy. That's the fetal stage. You probably caught that because I think I said it correctly in the slide. I just verbally said it wrong. Now I want to show you this. This is cool. This animation took me a while to do. Okay, look at the baby for a sec. This isn't going to be impressive, but boom. I figured out how to save that animation. Okay, so see how I basically drew what looks like a upside down pear or like a nail or a screw head or something? But they call that like, that's actually what's called a neural tube. So it's like, it's not a brain yet. It's not a brain yet, but what it is it's neurons, what are going to be your brain cells, forming in a group. This is the first step. So there's 4 steps in your building your brain. And I'll be kind of quick on this because I kind of freestyle ranted this a little bit earlier in the presentation. But think about this. The first step is that they have to come together, right? There's this neural tube. By the time a baby's born, they have approximately 100 billion neurons. And a neuron is a specific type of cell that can process information. They're mainly in the brain. You have neurons in your gut. You have neurons in other parts of your body, but primarily in your brain. As a human embryo develops inside the mother's womb, the nervous system begins forming this long, hollow tube located in the embryo's back. And so this is kind of like your spinal column and your brain. Because your spinal column, again, is like so intimately connected with your brain. It's hard to say where they're different, but they're interconnected, like both literally and in terms of function and process. This pear-shaped neural tube, which forms at about 18 to 24 days after conception, develops out of the ectoderm, like ECTODERM. The tube closes at the top and bottom at about 24 days after conception. So 24 days after conception, it's not a brain yet, but it's brain cells organizing in a group, basically in this neural tube. Okay. So I'm going to say there's 4 phases, right? The brain, you can almost look at the development of the brain as these 4 phases. Even just the title of the slide, prenatal brain development phase number 2. The first phase is them forming together in the neural tube. The second phase is that then the number increases, right? Neurogenesis, the creation of more neurons. At the peak of neurogenesis, it's estimated that as many as 200,000 neurons, remember cells that process information, are being generated every minute. It's like, that's wild, right? Every 5 minutes, then a million new cells that process information. So they get together in the neural tube, then the numbers explode. Okay, so that's the first 2.
In the last module, we took first steps towards understanding the electrical properties of individual neurons. We learned how electrical forces and diffusion give rise to membrane potentials, and we learned how cells can generate and propagate signals called action potentials, or spikes, along the membrane. Understanding the properties of the neuronal membrane is essential, but understanding just these properties isn't sufficient to give us insight into collective behavior of the billions of connected neurons in our brains. Luckily for us, we can approach neuroscience at many different scales and levels of analysis, and we don't have to confront the full complexity of everything all at once. That's what we'll be exploring throughout the rest of this course as we slowly go from our understanding of single molecules, such as ion channels, to the electrical behavior of neurons, to their collective behavior in small circuits, and finally onto how they become organized in large functional regions of the brain. Let's start simple, though. Since we've examined one neuron, a logical next question is, how do 2 neurons connect with one another? We'll first examine some basic cellular anatomy of neurons. So far, we haven't made too much of the fact that the majority of neurons are polarized cells. That is, they have one portion of the cell for receiving inputs and another portion for sending outputs. The parts of the cells that are specialized for receiving inputs from other cells are called dendrites. The word dendrite comes from the Greek word dendron, meaning tree, and as you can see, the dendrites have a branching, tree-like structure. A signal received by a dendrite is passed to the cell body. If there is sufficient depolarization of the cell body membrane to initiate an action potential, then an action potential is sent down the axon. The axon then carries the propagating action potential to another neuron. So what actually happens at the boundary between two neurons, between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of another? This interface is called a synapse. There are two general types of synapses: electrical synapses and chemical synapses. Electrical synapses are less common in our own nervous systems, but they're simpler to think about, so let's start with them. Electrical synapses are basically pores between two cells that allow ions to pass through. They allow the passage of the electrical signal through to a neighboring cell without much fuss. It's not so different than just combining two cells into one larger cell. There are lots of reasons that nature might need synapses like this from time to time. They're fast, and they allow cells to couple together with a high degree of synchronicity. But most neurons are connected together by a much more complicated structure called a chemical synapse. In a chemical synapse, rather than simply passing along an electrical signal from one cell to another, the action potential travels to the end of the axon and causes a chemical to be released into a very small space between the two neurons called the synaptic cleft. This chemical is taken up by the downstream neuron on the other side of the cleft. This chemical signal can cause the downstream neuron to depolarize its membrane, converting the chemical signal back into an electrical one. Or it can have other effects on the cell. This chemical step is slower than transmission across an electrical synapse, but it opens up an enormously diverse repertoire of different and more complex kinds of signaling. And synaptic function plays a critical role in computations performed by neurons. We'll spend the rest of this unit exploring the inner workings of chemical synapses, on our way to beginning to look at how networks of interconnected neurons give rise to behavior. We'll also look at the role of defective synaptic physiology in neurological and psychiatric disorders, and we'll see how synapses can be targeted by various psychoactive drugs and poisons. Finally, we'll wrap up by looking at how synapses can change over time in response to external stimuli, playing a foundational role in how we learn and remember.
I hope you found that last video kind of interesting. As you can tell in this presentation, I've been kind of pulling videos from all over. Some of them are kind of like some of the evolution ones are kind of like those animated ones, and then some of these are like also animations, but more graphical depictions of cells and stuff like that, because I'm trying to show you also what I'm saying. So now if we think about this from the perspective of, wait, one more. See, I almost didn't put that on the screen. That would have messed up the recording. So they come together in this neural tube. The numbers increase. So now you have all these brain cells, but then they have to kind of go to where they're going, right? They have to migrate, move from one place to another, migrate to the place where, like some of it's going to process visual information, some of it's going to be related to memory. It's like they're going to go to different areas. This mass movement of neurons from the germinal zone, so the germinal zone meaning like the place where, picture them all being generated here and then moving out. So where they're all being generated is the germinal zone. And they're spreading out radially and tangentially and diagonally, which just means like they're going from here to here, straight out, and they're going to the side, and they're going on angles. They're just going all around. Radially, tangentially, and diagonally is just a fancy way of saying they're moving all around in different directions. They're spreading out. So now those are the first three things, and it's actually pretty interesting, hopefully, and complicated. I keep saying things are interesting. I hope you're finding it interesting. That basically they come together, the neural tube, they expand the numbers, neurogenesis, then they start to move into their position, neuromigration. So hopefully this breakdown's like kind of making the concept easy to grasp. Okay, then the last phase, I'm going to show my last video of today's is going to touch on this topic. Then the wiring has to connect. So it's based, so then the cells have to connect. I meant to say, I just read the word wiring. It's like a wiring diagram. It's like how, if you were to look at how all the electricity in the house, it's like, oh, it all comes in from, it comes in from the road, comes into the side of the house through the garage. That's where the main power source is, and then there's like major lines that come to each floor, and then from those lines there's outlets, just like the pole lines that you see outside with the core, with the not hydro poles, but the electrical poles, right, that have the highest cable you see is the highest voltage. It's the most dangerous one. It's the one that goes like the furthest, and then all the lower ones are like the ones that segues down to connect to like individual houses or whatever. I don't know why I'm going so far on what wiring means. I'm sure you've heard of electricity, but basically the wiring in the brain has to connect. It's all formed in the neural tube through that first phase. Through the second phase, which we call neurogenesis, the numbers increase. Then through neuromigration, the third phase, they move around, and then this fourth phase is they interconnect. How they connect, just like a genome is a map of your genes, a connectome, which is just spelled like the word connect with OME on the end. It's just kind of like a specific word that's saying like what the wiring diagram of your brain would look like. A connectome is this comprehensive map of the connections in the brain. You could think of it as a wiring diagram. A connectome would include all the mapping of all neural connections within an organism's brain and nervous system. So it's like the connections your brain's making. Because remember, like my ability to go like this with my hand, that's all like the ability of my brain to send the message here, right? And when people have things like multiple sclerosis, and I'll talk about what that is later in the course, and it interferes with that signaling, and the person has less control over their hand, you can see very clearly how me doing this under my own control is more than just muscular. It's actually signal based. Okay, so I have one more video for you, and then I'll just say a concluding remark.
Everything you see here is real data. We're looking through a microscope at neural tissue, going down through an area of the brain called the medial prefrontal cortex. We can use these microscopic images to reconstruct the three-dimensional layout of the neurons and really see the intricate and intertwining patterns that they make. These connectivity patterns throughout the brain underlie all neural function and are responsible for everything from controlling your muscles when you tie your shoes to how you feel about your family. Understanding these patterns is a massive ongoing project for neuroscientists everywhere and could lead to breakthroughs for everything from consciousness to depressive disorders and schizophrenia. In this example, we injected purple dye into a far distant brain region called the amygdala, which is largely where our emotions and feelings of fear are generated. The purple wires are axons, or connections, coming from the amygdala into this area. We've also used some recent advancements in genetic engineering to select only the neurons inside this region that connect to the amygdala and dye them green. By combining both the green and purple dyes, we're able to see the full circuit of connections, viewing both the neurons that connect to the amygdala and connections coming back in from the amygdala. The locations and patterns of the neural connections, called synapses, show us how heavily these two groups of neurons are connected. To help us start to understand the incredible complexity of these neural networks, we develop computational techniques that segment or isolate individual neurons. By isolating a neuron, we can measure its characteristics, like size, shape, how many branches it has, and what general type of neuron it is. This may not seem like much, but it's really important for understanding so much about the brain. For instance, we know that malnutrition, stress, and cognitive disorders can all change how these branches look, but there are so many details that we don't know. That's why we, as scientists, keep pushing the envelope. To tackle these very complicated questions, we are getting together and combining fields ranging from physics and biology to mathematics and computer science. Every year, every day, we learn so much more. This is the most exciting and progressive time for neuroscience that there has ever been.
That was a pretty neat video of the mind in action. So you've survived the presentation. I know this got a bit long. It's like almost, over 2.5 hours, the two of them combined, almost 3 hours. But I hope you learned something. I hope you found that interesting. And I could have made it shorter if I cut out all the videos, but I thought the videos broke it up a bit, made it not just me talking, and also hopefully showed you some of what I was telling you. And see you next time. Cheers.